Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is new financing and ownership strategies for solar+storage in low-income communities. We have some excellent guest speakers with us today. And before I pass it over to them and to our hosts for today's webinar, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. If you would like to minimize or expand your webinar console, you can do that using the little red or orange arrow that you see circled here. In terms of the audio, you have a couple of options to connect. You can use your computer, mic, and speakers, or you can call in using a telephone. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will be saving about 15-20 minutes at the end of our presentation for a Q&A with the audience. And we do expect to have a lot of people on the line today. That should mean a lot of questions. So do submit your questions when you think of them. Don't wait until the very end. That just increases your chance that we'll be able to get to your question. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email within about 48 hours with a link to the webinar recording and a copy of the webinar slides. And we'll also be posting those on our website, and that is www.resilient-power.org. You can find all of our past webinar materials there as well. So with that out of the way, I would like to get the webinar started. And first we will be hearing from Lou Milford. Lou is president of Clean Energy Group. And I should have mentioned that Clean Energy Group and our Resilient Power Project are the hosting entities for today's webinar. So Lou, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Sam, and welcome everyone here on the webinar. We've got, I think, over 400 people signed up, so it indicates we've got some serious interest in this topic. My job is pretty easy, and Sam, I'm not advancing this well for some reason. There we go. My job's pretty easy. I'm just going to quickly introduce who Clean Energy Group is, and then I'm going to manage questions at the end for the speakers, and I just would encourage you all to be thinking about questions as the webinar proceeds, so you can get in the queue, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. So Clean Energy Group is a national nonprofit. We work on clean energy, as the name implies, at the state and local level. We've been doing this for about 20 years. And the organizations you see there are our chief funders. This is a principally foundation-funded effort. We don't take any corporate contributions, so our interests are independent, and we try to provide some decent independent information as we're doing here today. Sorry about that. So let me advance this. The Resilient Power Project started about 5 years ago when it was really prompted in large part by the after effects of Superstorm Sandy in the East Coast, where millions of people who were without power had a disproportionate impact on low-income communities. So we started this project to look at some technology solutions, principally solar and storage, that could be applied in both affordable housing, critical community facilities, to provide power as outages occur, and also to look at some of the economic benefits of installing these new technologies in those sectors. So we have been working with projects, with policy folks around the country, advocating for accelerated project development and policies that could help advance this sector. We are working on somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 projects around the country. There we go. So we're providing technical assistance in some cases to project developers who are working in affordable housing space, critical community facilities, as well as low-income groups, so that they have sort of added capacity to understand what are pretty complicated, sometimes technical and financial questions in getting these projects underway. So I only have one more slide, and I'm going to turn it over to the speakers today. The basic premise of this work is that We have kind of a clean energy divide at work here. There are now hundreds, potentially thousands of solar and storage projects that we see around the country. Most of them are fairly high-end commercial establishments that are using those technologies to save on their electric bills, which is fine. That's how early markets typically are. And that market is going to grow exponentially. But what we have, on the other hand, in low-income markets are too few projects in housing developments and community facilities, and that's really the focus of this today. But on the other hand, ironically, there's a much greater need in having people provide power to vulnerable populations and also to save money. And so there's often an unequal distribution of public incentives, and so more should be provided to the low-income space, and we need these targeted low and moderate income strategies. So I'm going to stop there just with that framing set of questions. I'm going to turn it over to Rob Sanders, who's the Senior Finance Director of Clean Energy Group, has been working on a lot of these finance issues, and we'll talk about the paper that prompted this webinar, and you're going to hear from some good speakers, including Bracken and Jared. So Rob, you got it.
Great, thanks, Lou. One major aspect of our work is to understand and write about the issues and opportunities related to financing resilient power in low-income communities. So we have a lot of reports you may want to take a look at resilient-power.org. And a key aspect of our work on finance is related to the projects that we support through the Technical Assistance Fund, which provides third-party technical services grants to evaluate solar and storage projects for public buildings, critical services, and multifamily affordable properties, more affordable housing properties. So how are solar and storage projects financed today? Still important at this stage in the market, especially in low-income communities, are the local and state incentives. And I think some states that do a particularly good job in developing policy and incentives have been Massachusetts, California, and DC and New York. Federal tax credits, there's a 30% investment tax credit, which is critical, and that's available for solar and storage when the battery storage is charged by the solar PV panels. And then low-income housing tax credits can also be a source of equity for energy upgrades, including Solar+Storage. Utility incentives, I would take a look at the Con Edison program as a strong incentive program. The Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Area program is particularly useful for some of these projects. Solar+Storage companies, these are tend to be earlier stage companies that have assembled project finance funds, are sometimes venture-backed, and also have private equity. And these are beginning to be rolled up into much larger corporations at this time, but that's still a way that some of these projects are being funded in low-income communities. Large energy service companies. These are ESCOs like Johnson Controls and Schneider Electric, who are particularly interested in the MUSH markets, the municipal, university schools, and hospitals. Bond financing. One of the projects we're going to be talking about later today is a public housing project that included bond financing as part of its capital stack. But schools, large nonprofit institutions, private activity bonds are all used in energy upgrade projects, including the solar. And then lastly, non-recourse project financing. This is really how many major utility scale or other kinds of commercial generation projects are financed, and they're non-recourse, and they're important to being able to finance these technologies. The I'm going to give an example of how an affordable housing, multifamily affordable housing project in East Brooklyn has been financed with non-recourse project financing. Last year, a large privately owned affordable housing project, Marcus Garvey Apartments, owned by L&M Development Partners, was commissioned. Large solar array, 400 kW storage, 300 kW, 1200 kW hours of capacity, and it was financed with a non-recourse project financing loan from NYCEEC, which is the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation, using a special purpose entity created by the solar developer, Demand Energy. So 95% financing was provided under this construction term loan, 10.5 years term. So we're beginning to see access to non-recourse project financing for these projects. Another project I wanted to highlight, and it'll be talked about further in this presentation, is a public housing project in DC, which closed on its financing just last month. It's not been developed yet, but it will be the largest solar and storage project in multifamily affordable housing in the country. And it's a public-private financing project where low-income housing tax credits and solar and storage investment tax credits and a tax-exempt bond, solar renewable energy certificates, housing production trust loan fund, the large one, and DC grants all made this project come about. So for those who have an interest in different kinds of ownership and financing strategies for low and moderate income projects using solar and storage, I recommend a couple sources to take a look at. We were commissioned by the Kresge Foundation, CERDNA, and JPP Foundations to conduct a capital scan that would look at what are the barriers to more solar and storage in low-income communities, and what might be some foundation interventions that would make a difference, which would accelerate adoption of those technologies, with a particular eye towards financing, PRIs and MRI investments. So about over 50 recommendations were made, and some of the examples might be support new tax credit aggregation strategies, or provide loan guarantees and other credit enhancement and PRI structures to reduce performance and financial risk. The other resources is really the subject of this webinar today, the Owning the Benefits of Solar Storage report that we did, New Ownership and Investment Models for Affordable Housing. And here, there are a couple examples of those structures are going to be discussed in today's webinar. But if you want to take a look at the report, again, going to resilient-power.org, you'll find some discussion on immediate direct ownership structures, on third-party ownership flips, including those that involve an affiliated entity, civic PACE models with third-party ownership, and utility contract payment for services models. So that's what I wanted to highlight before getting to our guest panelists. We're really fortunate to have two very good speakers today. Bracken Hendricks, who is the CEO and founder of Urban Ingenuity. Bracken manages efforts to finance and develop solar energy and microgrid projects with a special focus on reaching underserved communities. He also oversees the DC Commercial PACE financing program. And also with us is Jared Lang, who's Assistant Vice President for Sustainability at National Housing Trust. Jared is responsible for integrating sustainability and renewable energy into affordable housing projects. Especially appreciate Jared being on today. He's not feeling well, and but I imagine you won't even notice as he gets into his presentation. So Bracken, if you want to start off, that'd be great.
Great, thanks very much, Rob and Lou. and Sam for pulling this together. So I'm Bracken Hendricks. I'm CEO of Urban Ingenuity, and we are based in Washington, D.C., but we work nationally to deploy capital into clean energy projects with a special focus on low-income, affordable housing and community-based economic development projects. Do a lot of work with nonprofits. And as Rob was just saying, one of the key goals of this presentation is to dig into how to own the benefits of solar plus storage. So solar projects in a low-income, affordable housing context can create a lot of additional cash flow and a lot of, it's a valuable asset that improves the long-term affordability and the preservation of affordability for these critically needed community assets. Capturing the benefits from solar and then enhancing those benefits by adding in storage and the resilience that comes from that it's really an emerging art and science. Urban Ingenuity has been very, very pleased to partner with National Housing Trust over the last year or more to bring scale to some really innovative pilots that Jared and his team at the National Housing Trust have been leading on, which are really focused on taking the ownership of solar projects under a PPA structure or similar structure and making them much more widely available for affordable housers and really unpacking how that works. I think there's been a lot of creativity and innovation that NHT has led on. Urban Ingenuity has joined to create this sort of partnership to bring scale in terms of sourcing tax equity and debt and helping make this model replicable. So as we go through the presentation today, we're going to first dig into structures for ownership of these assets broadly. And Jared's going to walk you through a model for thinking about, in the context of low and moderate income housing, thinking about ownership of these solar assets. But it's thinking about solar plus storage is really the same capital and financing challenge with some wrinkles that have to do with the cash flows and the nature of the costs for storage. So Jared will walk you through the ownership models, building on their solar experience, and then I'm going to dig in on the backside of the presentation to discuss the specific case study that Rob introduced in the District of Columbia, this very large low-income affordable housing solar plus storage project that is under construction now with the Housing Authority and a number of other local partners. So Jared, you maybe want to introduce yourself and NHT?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Jared Lang. I'm with National Housing Trust, and I apologize for my voice. I wish that Rob was right and that no one would notice on this phone, but I doubt that that's the case. I'm a little under the weather today, but I wanted to power through and be there for my colleagues and share a little bit about what we've done so far. So the National Housing Trust is probably best known as an advocacy organization for affordable housing at the federal and the state level, but we also are an owner and operator of about 5,000 affordable housing units along the East Coast. So we're a housing developer, and we really use our portfolio as a way to try a lot of innovations in finance and residential services and sustainability, and then share those innovations with our colleagues. So in 2014, we started to look at how we would own solar and what are the different ways to own solar. So the slide that you're looking at here is sort of the series of projects that we've done so far in solar. And, as you can see, we've done about 4 megawatts of solar so far. And we take a very real estate owner perspective to it, and a very low income real estate owner perspective. So I'm going to walk through a little bit on kind of the different ways that we thought about solar and battery storage, and how you could own those assets and gain the most benefit from them. So I would say Bracken, is the next slide yours?
I'm happy to jump in, absolutely. A little bit on urban ingenuity so you understand the pieces. We are the administrator of the Washington, D.C. PACE program. We were incubated out of a regional affordable housing developer. And so as we created the PACE program here in the district, structuring long-term, long-dated debt finance to fund clean energy projects, we gravitated towards affordable housing and ended up kind of backing into some innovative projects nationally. We did the first low-income housing tax credit project that was financed using PACE. Separately, the first affordable housing project that had received full HUD approval for the use of PACE in conjunction with various forms of HUD subsidy and assistance. And then ultimately we did, more recently, the first use of tax-exempt funds to fund PACE. And this is something we're exploring very actively on a national basis, bringing low-cost tax-exempt debt to these affordable housing projects. In the context of that, we've done a megawatt plus of solar financing alongside of about $35 million worth of capital investment into clean energy projects. We've done a very large stadium solar project, all the way down to a small canopy on a gas station. So we've sort of looked at solar from a number of contexts. In addition, we do a lot of work at the campus scale, the neighborhood scale, working on microgrid efforts, which has caused us to work on energy storage from battery storage through to thermal storage, and cogeneration and other sorts of distributed energy assets. And increasingly seeing very, very strong demand for the solar plus storage technology mix. And so we've been very excited most recently to be digging into bringing together solar and battery storage. And we'll talk a little bit later about the case study of this project that we did with the District Department of Energy and Environment and the Housing Authority and the private development team that are doing a very deep gut rehab of a large campus scale energy project where we brought storage in for resilience and we layered in a number of these financing and funding structures. But really the guts of what we want to share with you are the mechanisms for financing options for bringing to bear this technology on the ground. These are complicated projects and it's hard to implement them because it's hard to understand the cash flows in order to understand how to bring to bear debt and equity, how to de-risk those investments so the investors are comfortable with them, and how to make sure that you're really monetizing and realizing the cash flows and the savings that are expected to come from them. In thinking through how to develop these solar plus storage projects, we think it's really useful to think first about individual project level, property level installations. Jared's going to dig into sort of going at the direct purchase by an affordable houser and what that means to the housing developer versus a power purchase agreement, which is the most predominant way of owning solar assets. But in both cases, those are generally done at the individual facility level. In addition, we think it's important to understand that if you're doing low-income housing tax credit deals, you can actually bring the solar or the solar and storage into the basis of that tax equity financing as well. But still, folks are generally thinking at the individual property level. So one of the innovative pieces of the NHT model that Jared's been doing that our partnership, NHT-Ingenuity Power, is now scaling, is to really look at the portfolio level, aggregate a pooling of those solar assets. And we think this is an exceptionally appropriate way to start looking at storage. When you're looking across 8-10 properties for one housing owner, you can surface the 2 or 3 where that storage will really do the most good, yield the best economics, and create the best social equity and resilience benefit. So, Jared, maybe you want to take over the reins and run through some of the financials of these different approaches.
Sure. So I think it's a really fundamental piece, and I believe probably many of the people, or if not all of the people on the phone, understand that in the sort of the fundamental structure of real estate, in that there is a corporation and then each of the properties are set up as individual LLCs and they function as their own small businesses. So as we go to think about putting solar on a property, it's not a matter of whether our corporation, the National Housing Trust, can afford to make that investment if it wanted to. It's actually a matter of whether the property business, this individual LLC that runs this property, has the equity or income to invest in this asset. So I think that's just a really important piece to keep in mind going forward. You know, these corporations own multiple individual assets. So next slide?
Yeah, I think you have the reins now. There you go.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I just clicked it. So I just want to start out and talk a little bit about, you know, just a basic case study. I'm going to cover this quickly, but I'm kind of like a numbers guy. I like the case studies and to see some of the actual examples. So this is a property that we own in DC called St. Denis Apartments, and it's a 32-unit affordable housing property, and it is 60% area median income. So we looked at putting solar on this property, and we decided that we could fit about 15 kW up there, and that it would cost about $50,000. And, you know, we kind of like said, what are our financing options for this? So this slide is on the top is if we were to purchase it, and on the bottom is if the property business were to purchase the system. So this little business that runs St. Denis Apartments is a single asset entity, and if it were to purchase. So then we also looked at, you know, maybe we could lease this from a third party. So I just want to talk a little bit about the numbers here. So a 15 kW system we estimated was about $50,000. And then, so on the financial side, I think you could see under 2014, there's a federal investment tax credit for 30%. And then our initial all-in investment would be $35,000. And then we estimated that the savings and the incentives would be about $9,000 a year, and it would be about a 4-year payback. So we took a look at this originally, and we were like, wow, this is you know, these deals are very state specific. I know that Rob mentioned, you know, based on the incentives, and this includes a DC incentive. But we looked at this and we were like, this is like the kind of investment that we want to make all day. But we realized that, one, this property didn't have the $50,000 to spend on the system, and two, it doesn't have a tax interest. It does not have the tax appetite to be able to use this tax credit. So we were disappointed, but then we said, you know, we still want to do solar, and what's the way that we could do that? You know, so we looked at this sort of leasing, this like power purchase model, and because we're green and we wanted to really try something, we did a couple of these where we brought in a third party to invest in the system and take the tax credit, and then sell us power at a discount. And I think you can see, you know, in 2014, our equity investment, there's really no investment. It's just actually you know, the legal fees to review the agreement with the third party. But the savings, you know, a 15 kW system is so small that, you know, we get 20% off, and the savings are $1,000 a year. So just going through this, it wasn't worth our time to figure out how to, you know, do these power purchase agreements. And, you know, I think this is where a lot of solar, a lot of batteries, a lot of this falls down, is that the corporations that would make these investments are not able to do this on behalf of their properties, and the properties don't have the tax interest or the ability to invest. So we thought about this for a little bit, and we said, what's a way that we could make this investment in this system, and how could we do multiples of these across our portfolio? So in our first one in 2014, we said, what if we set up a solar company to own and operate multiple solar systems, finance it? We bring in a tax investor to partner with us. We get to a certain scale that would interest a tax investor. And then we purchase all these systems, and then we sign agreements with our own properties to sell power. And we could control the discount to the properties. We could give greater discounts than what's industry standard. And it makes it so that we could put a solar deal together that creates a development fee for us for spending our time for doing all this work. There's an ongoing asset management fee for managing this new solar company. It helps us get to like the right economies of scale where it makes sense to actually take out a loan and partner with a tax investor and deal with the transaction costs. And then, if we made any investment, we also got some points on the investment that we made. So, this is it's not an easy, I don't think this is necessarily an easy concept. I was in a meeting yesterday with a very, very smart housing owner who I usually have to have this conversation multiple times with people until they really get their head around it. But this is a little sort of graphic of what it looks like. So I think people can see my cursor. So we would we would set up this special purpose entity, the solar entity, that would buy solar across multiple properties. And we would join in a 99-1 partnership with a solar tax investor. The tax investor takes the credits, and we manage this. And then we sign agreements to sell power at certain prices. And what's nice is that we can actually, certain properties that are deeply affordable and actually need more benefit, we can give those groups bigger discounts on the power. And the other properties that don't need it so much can almost help cross-subsidize the ones that do. So we've done, at this point, completed about 5 of these. We have a lot of other housing owners that have reached out to us around the country. And that slide at the beginning with noted Link Housing in Southern California, and we did a project with the Denver Housing Authority. So we're going around the country, us and Urban Ingenuity, teaching housing owners how to own solar assets in pools for themselves. So this is I'm going to try to cover this a little more quickly. I think I'm getting up on my time. So this is a project that is 8 sites, a total of 1 megawatt of power, and then 1 site that has a 350 kW battery. So as you can see, in the sources and uses right here, this total project, we went from a $50,000 project with St. Denis to a pretty substantial project with, a $4 million project. So I'm getting a note from Sam. Is everyone okay with the volume?
Sounds okay from here.
Okay, great. Okay, so this project now, we had a little $50,000 project that really didn't make sense to set up debt and bring in equity, and now we combined all these projects together, We're going to be able to do a battery. We're going to be able to do 8 sites of solar, and we're going to be able to, it's $4 million. It's $1.2 million in tax credits. I can tell you that's still small for a lot of the tax investors that we work with. But it's a good start. And I think, this is the kind of approach that is working and really making solar feasible for these real estate owners. So this, I always enjoy the numbers. This is kind of a brief pro forma. I'll just touch on it here, and then you all can go back later. I know this is going to be posted and take a look. So, the income is from the solar company charges energy payments to the properties at some discount. Then there's, in DC, there's some solar renewable energy credits. And then our battery that does some frequency regulation. There's some value there. Then we have some, an operating expense. Then we take out a loan to pay for all the system. And, after that, we're left over with about $100,000 a year. And, we're finding that we can do deals like this, and we can easily get into, returns in the teens, which is where we like to be, 10 to 20%. And then, if we could leave ourselves open for an upside that could be higher than 20% if we operate well. So this is, that's the basic concept of portfolio scale solar and battery storage. We are working on a battery project right now, and hope to have, we've done multiple portfolio scale solar projects, and we're very excited about this model to be able to finance not only batteries and solar, but also fuel cell and wind and whatever other technologies that could support affordable housing that makes sense.
Great. And so I think the financials that Jared just showed you, walking through from the weaker individual project specific ones where you're trying to, you have to do a lot of brain damage in order to get to a very small benefit. And our experience in talking to and working with a lot of housers is that that's where the projects fall off. They do make economic sense, but it's the relative level of effort given the capacity challenges facing these often, very capacity constrained organizations, and the lack of mission alignment where their real mandate is to preserve more units of affordable housing. And if you're just shaving modest energy savings or providing modest resilience benefits, it's hard to get them focused on it. When you get the larger scale, and also some of what Jared was talking about, creating asset management fees, participation in the development, that's an economic model that's a lot closer to what the affordable houser does anyway. So really what they're doing is looking at generating more income in a traditional classic sense from their existing assets. So those pro formas kind of showed getting that scale, getting the returns up, getting the financial value proposition better organized to be actionable. And then it also showed the inclusion of the capital costs and the revenues that come from the battery storage element. But in putting together a Solar+Storage project, there really is a meaningful challenge. I mean, the houser, again, their mission is affordable housing. Very often there aren't strong mandates forcing them to do high degree of emergency backup. So you can't say, I'm going to be putting in very large backup generators and I can offset those costs through storage and storage. It becomes a nice to have, but not a must have asset. So really figuring out how to overcome these challenges of uncertainty, complexity, limited resources, and also the uncertainty in the market for these frequency regulation, income, or other forms of benefits that can come from the storage are pretty meaningful challenges. So what we tried to do in this pilot project in Washington, D.C., was really overcome those barriers to implementation by marrying solar and storage to a very large, complex gut rehab project where the owner and the developer, with the participation of various district agencies, they were open to having solar and they were open to the benefits of storage, but they were only going to pursue them if it was really advancing kind of their core mandate. So we, in this case study, we ended up looking at a project where we could go in and demonstrate a very sort of significant installation of solar initially was sort of the first charge. And we ended up putting together a very large project. It's, it's about eight buildings, 220 units of affordable housing. It had been sitting vacant for a very long time. So it was a complete gut rehab, and they did have some capital gaps. And by maxing out the solar in the DC market, we were actually freeing up cash flow that was actually able to help support the larger, mission of the gut rehab itself. So we were creating a new income stream for the solar, with the solar. We also were doing it because they were at the point of a recapitalization and they were bringing it into a new low-income housing tax credit compliance period. We were actually able to move this into the base financing so that the additional capital cost of the solar and then subsequently the storage actually increased the cost basis and enabled them to get more tax equity investment, more credit on the pure housing financial. So they liked it. We then had to wrestle with a lot of the housing specific challenges in bringing this project in, helping them figure out how to actually capture the benefits. The billing structure really mattered and how the utilities were paid. And we figured out a way, we were essentially offsetting tenant paid utilities with some of the electricity because we wanted to overbuild beyond what they could carry on the common area meter. And so we had to actually go in with them and work on changing the billing structure. And so we targeted their, project-based Section 8 voucher units, and we created a structure where it was owner-paid utilities for a certain group of the units so that they could actually have even more solar energy. So what we did was we created a design concept where they could build out to the maximum solar capacity. And then we started working on how to bring in storage to capture and demonstrate that. So this was a project where we wanted to demonstrate deep resilience and sustainability in an urban economic justice and environmental justice context. We had the full support of the housing partners, but as long as we did no harm to their timeline and their logistics, very importantly, and as long as we helped them optimize those economics and efficiently could deploy. And then we had a little bit of grant money as well that helped from the energy and environment agencies within the government as well. So there was an opportunity where we had an advocate who was really pushing for bringing the resilience benefits in. So we had the right group of partners, but even in that situation with all of the stars aligned, it was a tremendous amount of complexity to cut through in order to bring the capacity to help those development partners really kind of figure out the roadmap to deploy the solar plus resilience. And the project that we ended up coming up with is we ended up with about 700 kW of solar. There was a bunch of low-rise joined townhomes and a bunch of mid-rise stacked apartment buildings. They were also demolishing a property on the site. And there was an area that was really unclaimed and was actually sort of a security issue. So we were able to create some fenced ground mount as well. And then we went through the exercise of how to go about the sizing of the storage. And so in order to put together a project, we actually were very pleased to work with Clean Energy Group. They were tremendously helpful in giving us some capacity resources to bring in some additional engineering support and some additional technical support resources to figure out how do we go about sizing and scoping a storage project, because we were already pushing the envelope for the housers by pushing in such a large infusion of solar. So we went in and we initially sized the maximum potential based on the site footprint. And we figured that we could probably get about 1 megawatt of storage into the facility. But we had to take that and wrestle with a number of concerns. We had to look at the economics of what that very large capital cost would do to the full megawatt battery. And then we also had to wrestle with how we were going to get those resilience benefits. It would have been distributed across multiple properties, figuring out the electrical interconnection so that you were, the way that the individual metering of the units was, it was actually very hard to place the storage in relation to the solar and in relation to the load so that it was an islandable resource. We also had to wrestle with the sustainability aspects of it, because with a battery that large, with a 700 kW system, we would be integrating in some cases with the larger grid to keep the battery charged. And we'd no longer be dealing with green electrons. It changed both the sustainability and the economics as a investment tax credit project, unless we were sure that we were linking the storage and the solar benefits together. And finally, there was a very large policy risk where we could document these frequency regulation income streams from our independent grid operator, because they will pay you if you can bring that battery storage on in moments of into the electricity market in the regional grid. That's actually a valuable service. But for our investors, we couldn't give them the certainty that that would be available for the full 10, 15, 20-year life of the project. So that policy risk was real. So then we worked through these various constraints to come up with a battery project that was appropriately tailored for the project. We figured out where we would get the greatest resilience benefit by targeting the storage to the community centers, so there would be an available cooling center for the folks to kind of get, for their wider community in the event of a blackout. Refrigeration for medicines, air conditioning in high heat events, also charging of cell phones and those sorts of things. So we created an islandable, fully resilient energy backup for this community resilience hub built around the community center. And then we also provided that backup for the office to run the facility and some other security lighting and other sort of backup facilities. So we kind of integrated those solar resources that we could directly connect from certain of the roofs. We looked at the footprint in those 2 buildings that were most important to keep up and running. And then we tried to design the resulting system around resilience goals to hit critical loads for the maximum feasible duration of emergency use. And we ended up with about the 500 kW system, sort of back of envelope, 100 kW giving you, maybe 3 at the low end to more likely 5 hours of sustained benchmark load for our critical uses. So we were able to add 200 kW of the 500 feeding the office to give it a sort of sustained 10-hour life in a resilience period, and then 300 kW going to the community center, so that at that sort of 5-hour benchmark period, you'd be looking at kind of a 15-hour window to provide sustained usage. And in a sustained outage, that performance may decline a bit, but you would have, because of the solar and the storage were linked and islandable, you actually have a kind of an evergreen resource, not to provide full loads, but to provide base service of critical loads during sort of a sustained outage. And what we ended up doing, and we think we could have done a great deal more resilience, but we got to a system without upsetting the technical scope of the project, the timeline, the capital budget, the construction schedule, or the capital stack. We were able to introduce a large solar and storage intervention. And even from the storage, we're actually able to get some interconnection benefits that actually enhances the wider reliability of that area of the regional distribution grid. So it's a very exciting indicator for us of what we can do. So looking ahead with this program that we're building with NHT, this sort of partnership with NHT-Ingenuity Power, we are looking to figure out, as Jared said, there's projects coming together right now in California, in Colorado, in New York, in the District of Columbia, New Jersey, and we're seeing that wherever there's a strong solar market, there are differences, but we want to bring to bear the logic of solar plus storage and the resilience benefits with the sort of the framework of the benefits of pooled ownership for affordable housing developers to make this class of assets more easily understood and more reliable for low-income affordable housing project developers and owners. So I think we've got about 10 minutes now of remaining time on the clock. And I think Jared and I can stay a minute or two longer, but we'll certainly respect people's time at the strike of 2. But if there are good questions, we can hover. So maybe I'll kick it back. I think I hand it to you, Sam, to take the reins.
I think it's. I'll take it, Bracken. Thanks.
To Lou. There you go.
Lou, yeah. Great. Well, that's all. That excellent presentations, folks. So we've got a lot of questions. We'll try to cover what we can the next 9, 10 minutes, maybe go a few minutes over. So let me go back to some of these questions in order in which they came. First one is just sort of definitional terms. I think, Rob, this is to you. What's non-recourse finance, and then just identify the acronyms PRIs and MRIs.
Yeah, non-recourse project financing means that the sponsor, the property owner, is not guaranteeing repayment, but the project itself is where you turn for recourse if there's a failure in making payments. So it's the project is on the line, not necessarily the sponsor or the property owner. The PRI means program-related investment, which is can be structured as loans or near equity investment on the part of a foundation, but it's the source of the funding for those program-related investments is from the charitable side of the house. It's from program-related funds. Mission-related investment is from the corpus, from the endowment of a foundation. So it must be commercially feasible. It must be what they used to call prudent man standard of investment criteria, and so it's a higher standard of credit.
Okay, great. So we did get questions again about whether this is going to be recorded. It is. Sam will explain that. And also, we'll provide contact information. There's some questions that are pretty specific to Jared, Bracken. I'll leave that for folks to do later. There's sort of a general question. This is for everybody. Why aren't more CDCs taking up renewables in multifamily housing? It's sort of not required anywhere. What's going on? Are people seeing the same thing? I mean, in the capital scan report that Rob mentioned, there's a lot of barriers to doing this, but let me leave it to Jared and Bracken to just touch on that. Why not more of this, and what do we expect?
So this is Jared, and I can speak from the perspective of a lot of the affordable housing owners that I know, and that it's a new technology, and they are a lot of real estate people and economic development people, and they don't necessarily understand the tech and the paybacks. So there's hesitation to invest. And then when they do want to invest, they underwrite it in ways that, sort of discount the savings small enough to where it makes it not worthwhile. It's really a challenge that I've seen.
And let me just add to that, this is Bracken. I think the case study, the way that Jared walked through that, I think is exactly kind of the financial answer. You end up with, you have, especially if you're a nonprofit developer and you can't monetize the tax credits, the investment tax credit and the accelerated depreciation available for solar, a huge piece of the incentive is gone. And then the projects are so small that it's very difficult to find individual projects where you can interest a tax equity investor who can monetize it. So essentially, they just kind of lose the benefits for this audience. And that's really one of the core pieces of logic of trying to pool these assets and then develop them in an aggregated way as a kind of clean energy housing affordability development thesis. And that's really the guts of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, I think you're right on. No, Bracken is right on. I mean, it's just getting to scale to make it worthwhile. It's I have so many conversations with housing owners that say, I'm busy with real estate development. How are you going to make this worthwhile? Where I'm going to pull people off of real estate development and do energy.
Okay, good answer. You mentioned tax equity investors, and there's a separate question that what's the process to identify tax equity investors? Sort of who are they? Are they foundations? Are they private entities? If you could talk to that a little bit.
Sure. So this is I think that what I've seen of the projects, of the solar projects and battery projects, more difficult than the tech in my mind is actually getting site control or finding the right sites, and then the tax investor. We find that in housing that the low-income housing tax credit has been around since the 80s, and it's a much more sophisticated market. And that on the flip side, the solar is much more sophisticated at the utility scale level. But at this level of $1 to $3 million of solar tax credits, it ends up being a lot of niche tax investors, some private wealth funds, sometimes some banks that are looking for Community Reinvestment Act programs. And we've been collecting these investors that can work in this space. It's a big challenge, but we bring that to the housing owners.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Sort of a general question. The question specifically was, can this work in Alabama? I think the question generally is, does this work only in competitive states that are not vertically integrated monopolies? Can they work in states that have vertically integrated monopolies? What's your take on that?
Sure. So it can work in Alabama. I've seen it work in Georgia. We have to get to, the problem is that, oftentimes you can't get to the scale that would reduce the cost enough. The challenge that you have in the South is that power rates are so low and there's not a lot of incentive, but you can make solar work. I'm seeing some costs that are solar fields in the low dollar per watt type of thing. Like, anyway, just for those that don't understand a dollar per watt, you can really get more cheaply develop solar with scale, but in those southern states, you really need to find scale.
So just one other piece to add in, the regulatory environment does matter in terms of how you're structuring it. So if you're building it around the repurchase of the energy through a power purchase agreement, the state of Virginia will not allow you to do power purchase agreements. So there are different things that, if you're in a state that has community solar policies, Minnesota, Massachusetts, California, Colorado, that greatly facilitates this. And then the subsidies vary very greatly from states. It's very easy to do this in the District of Columbia. It's a lot thinner if you go to Ohio. Alabama has decent policies actually in certain places, but as Jared said, ultimately you're offsetting a price per kilowatt hour of electricity. So it does become geographically dependent. You have to look at it by your current local policy environment.
Okay, good. There's a couple questions. I'll join them together around the new tax law. What's the general effect, and then more specifically, what's the effect of the new tax law opportunity zone financing? I'm not that familiar with it. I've heard about it. Do either of you folks or anybody else have a view on that?
So we're noticing more impacts of the tax law on the low-income housing tax credit side, because it's the sort of demand is going down. So they're feeling like they can basically pay less for the credits, but we haven't noticed a major impact on the at least at the scale that we work with in solar. So typically we actually get over $1 per credit for our tax credits. We were, before tax reform, we were getting, $1.10 to $1.20. After tax reform, we're getting more like $1.05 to $1.15. But at the scale that we're working at, that difference may be $20,000, on $1 million in tax credits. So it's not a deal breaker.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Get Greg.
Yeah, so what Jared is referring to is the law. As corporations are required to pay less taxes, they're chasing after these tax credits less. I just did want to, and that's what's depressing the pricing and creating gaps, especially on the affordable housing side. And as Jared said, the solar side has been more resilient. The opportunity zone financing, to the extent that it is an incentive for new capital to flow into key areas that are creating economic development and affordability, those are the types of incentives that we can absolutely bring those into these solar asset developments. And I think that without getting into it, I think the mechanism can bring additional resources to well-priced debt and equity for these projects. And I think all of that economic development toolkit is needed to come to bear.
Okay, great. We'll go for like 3 more minutes to 2:05 for people if just hang in there. Are these projects, this is for Jared and Bracken, are these single meter projects or multi-meter facilities, and explain the difference?
I'm not sure. So there may be a property that has multiple meters. So I would say there's one property could have 5 systems if it had 5 buildings with individual meters. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that's the question that they're trying to get at.
I think the question is also drilling down on tenant metering versus sort of master metered versus tenant metered. Probably and so if the individual units are each paying their own electricity, that essentially means they have their own separate relationship with the utility company. So the developer in that situation can max out their roof space and point it at the common area load, the security lighting, the halls, those sorts of things. In places where there's a community solar program, they can actually overproduce and then sell it to the individual units as well, and then try and serve the whole property. Again, I would say, based on the metering and the billing structure, there's generally a way you can design a viable solar project. You do have to apply some creativity. You have to think very clearly, whose bill is the solar offsetting, and is there enough electricity load to justify this much solar to make the economics work? But so it's site specific, but you can make it work in a lot of different contexts.
I think this gets to us, and there were several questions about the actual renter benefits from these projects. Can you talk about that a little bit?
You want to talk, Jared, about some of the pass-through of the tenant benefits? We're doing that a lot right now. We've got about 2.5, 3 megawatts going in DC, where we actually have to pass free electricity through to the tenants very specifically.
So I could say that from some of the developments I've seen, some of the best approaches to really having the biggest impact on the residents is through community solar. And we in DC there's a good community solar law where you can develop assets on another rooftop anywhere around town and then allocate credits to residents. And we worked on one of the projects that we worked on was actually with the law firm Nixon Peabody, where they developed solar on top of 3 office buildings in downtown, and then we allocated the power to our residents. But we also do things where we take some of the income from the solar company and put it toward resident services and resident needs.
Great. Well, thanks. That's great. I think we're about at 2:05. I think we're going to probably close it up. And this has been very good, and we'll try to maybe answer some of the specific questions in a general comment if we can, or try to get back to folks with some specific questions that we didn't get to. So let me turn it over to Sam.
Thanks, Lou, and thank you very much to our speakers and to everyone who attended. I just want to direct your attention to some of the contact info on your screen now if you'd like to follow up with us with any other questions that you might have. I'd also like to encourage you to visit our website, resilient-power.org. There's a lot more resources there in addition to all of our previous webinar recordings, and that's where this webinar recording will be posted. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. And before we sign off, I just want to let you know about a couple of related webinars that we have coming up. These webinars are being hosted through Clean Energy Group's sister organization, the Clean Energy States Alliance. And both of these webinars coming up in April happen to be about FERC Order 841 and the implications for clean energy. And on April 4th, we'll be talking with speakers from Customized Energy Solutions about the implications for energy storage. And then on April 26th, we'll be talking with Jack Moore from NRDC about some of the broader implications. So if those sound like they might be of interest, I encourage you to go to cesa.org/webinars to read more about what we'll be covering in those webinars and to sign up. So again, please feel free to follow up with us with any follow-up questions, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thanks, everybody.